Everyone, and welcome back. We are live at the World of Wellness. This is Weiner Wellness Week number 100. I'm your host today, Jamie Dorley, with the co-host, the Godfather. Welcome back, Joe Messino.
Here we are, the big centennial. It's been crazy so far, and we're just getting warmed up.
Just getting warmed up so people can participate any which way they like. Of course, we like when they come in live because they can participate not only with the events and the specials, but what are some of the other things they can take advantage of today, Joe?
Well, you have so much going on. I mean, we have, of course, the great food truck out in the parking lot. We have Zeno out there. And for all you people that have come for years.
Mr. Z is back.
Yes, he's back. Years past, this is the guy that did those great spreads, those great vegetarian buffets, and he's now in the parking lot. You get a nice hot meal. All you got to do is come on down.
And he has my favorite, the vegetarian with organic chicken.
Ah, perfect.
Get the protein in, right? So we have Mr. Z. We have the treats going on. What's your favorite smoothie this week?
You know what? There's so many of them. Purple Haze is still at the top of my list, but we got a brand new one. We have Jailhouse Rock.
Oh, I know. I tried that one.
Did you try that?
I was
peanut butter and banana.
I wasn't expecting much, but when I tried it, I was blown away. He got me on that one. I'll tell you what.
It's a good one.
And we have very special guests here today, and he's coming all the way from Houston, Texas, Joe. He is not only a national but internationally known speaker and highly acclaimed speaker. He used to do the events with myself, and he spoke on one day and then Dr. Bland on the next. And he's very busy, so the fact that he would take time and share his knowledge and wisdom with us really tells me a lot about him. He's a man of faith, a family-owned guy, a family-owned business that he runs down in Texas. And we're so really proud, and we feel so fortunate to have Dr. Bob Rakowski back on live. How are we doing, Dr. Bob?
You know, I like to say I'm epic, and that description really fits it. Life is so good. Everybody's happy, healthy, thriving, and making the world better with great nutrition.
So we love how you bring not only the high energy, Joe, but high wisdom. And you talk about a guy who practices what he preaches. I've known him for about 20 years, and doesn't look like he's aged at all until he starts talking. Then I'm like, wow. He took what he knew then, and he's added on to it, I think, because his passion for teaching.
Oh, absolutely. You know, when you walk the walk and talk the talk, that's the epitome of living this life. And, of course, nobody does it better than Dr. Bob.
And recently he spoke at the conference in Columbus. So what was the name of that conference, Bob?
It was the Swiss conference, Society of Weightlifting Injury Specialists.
Oh, I love it. And I had a lot of my friends there, Joe DeFranco, Billy Nicole, a lot of trainers I know throughout the U.S. And the person they said that they loved hearing the presentation, I said, let me guess.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the one and only
That's
Dr. Bob. And, you know, when he talked about the topic with the cardiovascular, not only with the weightlifters, but performance and now everything going on with these cardiac events, I said, can you actually bring that to the team? Because we can't wait to hear this.
Yeah, we can't. You know, it's still the #1 killer out there. We still have people affected by it that we know, family members and friends. I just had a close friend go through multiple bypass surgery. And you know, it's just that's a reality that's still out there. And we have to do everything we can to prevent that event from happening.
Yeah, and I think we hit it up best this year, Bob, when we were talking. We said the old days of working out and eating good, that's not enough anymore. So when you started going into some of the levels he was, Joe, I was blown away. So, Dr. Bob, we're going to let you take it away, and we're here to support you today.
Well, you know what? You do that so well, and I'm gonna share my screen, and you know, there's so much interesting data. Now, how is it that I'm not able to do that?
There's a little box in the bottom. Looks like a computer screen with an
right.
arrow.
Here's what it says. Please update system permissions to allow screen recording from the browser.
This happened last time. It's okay. Can you email me the PowerPoint quickly? I'll share it.
Sure. I will.
So while he's emailing to Philly Phil, we can talk a little more, Joe, about some of the giveaways we have for coming in live this week. I see the Louis Vuitton wellness swag bags. Have you seen one of those before?
Only here. This is the first place you're going to see a wellness bag, a Louis V wellness bag, and it's the gift of health, the best gift there is.
Yep, you get a $100 gift bag just by coming and purchasing anything that has not only $100 worth of samples, but I just found out an extra savings for next year services, Joe, for the first time ever.
First time ever. You know, we've always had products on sale, but never services, and now till February 23rd, all services 20% off. Everything.
Yeah, and the great thing is that we're able to share some of the knowledge we've learned from some of our mentors like Dr. Bob and Dr. Weiner. And Dr. Bob was, one of the leading chiropractors for years. So, Bob, can you tell everybody about your practice a little bit and what you've been seeing and doing?
Yeah, of course. So this now makes 32 magic years in clinical practice. Amazing how time flies. And, early on, I started getting very, very interested in functional medicine, and I was focused on athletes. And, by my 10th year, I had seen world champions from every major professional sport. It was year 5 that Evander Holyfield came in, and that was a pretty big launch. And interestingly enough, after I started taking care of these super high-level athletes, they said, you know what, I've got a family member that has a bit of a challenge. Do you think you could help them? And sure enough, we applied functional medicine not only to sports nutrition, but to those that were critically ill. And by the way, we were at least a decade and a half ahead of the medical literature, because ultimately there came to be an article that was entitled The Application of Sports Nutrition in Critical Care Medicine. And you know what? The same things, same principles that we use to tune up elite athletes, we also use that for people that are fighting for their lives.
Right. To repair the body, right? That's what it really all comes down to.
You got it. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was interesting that you did that connection. In 15 years, Joe, ahead of the mainstream medical community, which to me is fascinating. And that's always been the exciting part of working with the athletes, is that they may not know exactly why at the beginning, but they are always a leader, right? They're at the forefront. And when you have people like Dr. Bob joining in with the science and the clinical application, that was the missing component for years.
Absolutely. And of course, all of these elite athletes have to deal with inflammation, right? And it's a different cause, but there's inflammation, and it enables them to heal, recover, and perform.
So, go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just going to say it took a few seconds to email the Dropbox link to the presentation, but I sent it right back to Phil. Is he the right guy to load it up?
Yep. Yeah, we're good to go.
He's got it.
So, can you maybe give us a little background in the last couple of years? I know you were one of the ones out there that I was watching videos every day, Joe, of him telling you to be happy, 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 have an epic day, and replace your fear with faith, right? Now, not everyone listened, of course, and we see where that got most people, sicker, more toxic. No, we've seen loved ones, Bob, family members, employees, employee families that really struggled the last few years. So what are some of the things you've been doing to help people with that whole fear with COVID?
Well, I like how you just described it, replace fear with faith. And, I'm going to tell a story because this story just is really hard hitting. So as the story goes, faith and fear were plague and fear were walking towards a town. And a traveler ran up to them as they're walking towards town and said, wow, what are you guys doing? And they said, we're going to go there and we're going to kill 100,000 people. And the guy looked at me and says, wow, you must be a horrible plague. He says, no. Fear is the real animal. He says, we're strong enough to kill a few, but we get fear on our side, we can kill hundreds of thousands. And I used to share a slide when Jeff Bland and I taught a seminar series on stress, or really distress. And it was called The Anatomy of Fear, but really it should be the physiology of fear. But when your body's in fight or flight, you don't think right, you don't experience joy, you don't digest right, your immune system gets suppressed. There's so many things that go awry. And, since you brought up this inflammatory process, you have a little bit too much stress, too much fear for a period of time, your body becomes cortisol resistant, which is far more dominant than insulin resistance. And you know what? That'll kill people. Just that simple.
That's an interesting concept. I've not heard cortisol resistance before, but wow, it's a whole new topic we'll talk about. So we're ready to jump right into the presentation, Dr. Bob. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Does Phil have me queued up?
Yep, he's queuing up a little bit more here. So
Yeah.
we're live at the Wine and Wellness Week number 100.
Centennial.
We have the host, Jamie Dorley, and the co-host, Joe Messino. Special guest on here, Dr. Bob Rakowski, zooming in all the way from Houston, Texas.
There we
Dr.
go.
Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Let's take it away.
All right. You know what? Just go ahead and jump on to the next slide. And this is Ken Kanakin, the organizer of the conference. And he sent me this note beforehand. He says, you know what, Bob? They've now measured the highest blood pressure they ever measured. That was on a high-level athlete on the leg press, 450 over 320.
What?
Yeah.
I didn't even know it would go up that high.
Well, this was new knowledge. And what's so fascinating is you have to make your whole body strong enough to be able to handle that lift.
That's
You know,
right.
Jamie, you've got quite a history yourself, and I know you've moved some heavy weight, but you probably never realized how high that pressure was elevated. So let's go to the next slide. Now, within the presentation, we'll go past that. Just a little bit of my background, seeing both ends of the spectrum and educating doctors all over the world. But the next slide, somewhere we're going to get to Eddie Hall, and I called it his near deadly deadlift. Are we able to advance the slide?
Go ahead.
And so let's go past this one again, the little bit of the outline. So when Eddie Hall did this lift, he was the first guy to lift half a metric ton, 500 kilos. So we're talking 1,100 pounds, but he had blood coming out of the corners of his eyeballs. He had blood coming out of his nose. He had blood coming out of his ears. He had blood coming out of his backside. Next slide, please. And you start looking, and this was for the athletes, the power lifters, you begin to realize that a deadlift is going to activate every single muscle in your body. So it's a good lift to train if you really want overall fitness. Next slide. And this is likely the video. And we'll probably not play this video with streaming quality, but Eddie, it just looks like I'm having, there we go. He went backstage and his blood pressure was still 200 over like 150, and his pulse was over 200 beats a minute. So he was at risk of cardiac arrest. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Incredible.
And when we look at the physiology of the Valsalva maneuver, every doctor has taught this. Every person does this when they have a bowel movement, but they were looking only at the intra-abdominal pressure and the intrathoracic pressure, but they weren't really looking at the intracranial pressure. And with some very sophisticated measurements, they found out that the pressure up there is just as high as it is in the thoracic cavity as well. Go ahead, next slide. And this basically shows how the body's ultimately going to compensate. And I put that 200 there because Eddie Hall's pulse rate and pressure maintained over 200 for about 20 minutes after that lift. Next slide. And so, there I just screenshot that where the guy tells him, your pressure is 203 right now. If you look at his eyes, he doesn't look too happy. He doesn't look too healthy. I think he was really in fear for his life at that moment. Next slide. And then he asked the cameras to stop, and I understand that, next slide. And the next day, he did not remember his wife's name. He did not remember his kids' names. And it took him days to recover this. And he used this exact language. If you look at the caption there, he basically blew his mind with serious brain bleeds. So, these athletes put themselves at risk. And by the way, let me just share a very simple way to get past that risk. You're not going to be able to lift the maximum lift, but here's the deal. If you actually exhale on the concentric portion of the lift, if you exhale as you're picking that weight up off the ground, that's a valve for that stress, and you'll decrease the intracranial pressure. So it literally can be that simple, but yet lots of problems there. Next slide.
I mean, that's something that you always hear, right? Always exhale on the exertion, right? Even if it's a push-up, you exhale on the push-up, right? I mean, so shouldn't they know that, Bob?
Well, they should, but if we showed that whole video, you're going to find that this guy had a squat suit, which allowed him to hold more pressure in his core. Then he had double belts, which allowed him to hold more pressure in his core. And here's the issue: without that level of stability, he wouldn't have gotten that weight up.
No.
So he had to go beyond what was previously thought possible. But this was, something called the Goldman dilemma. In 1984, this researcher Goldman went up to 198 athletes and said, look, if we could give you a drug that would guarantee that you would win every competition, that you would win the gold medal, but in 5 years you would die, would you do it? And here's the fascinating thing: 103 of these athletes said, yeah, I would. Now, you've got to begin to realize, how are these people so short-sighted? How do they not know that there's more to life than just what they're dealing with? And, there's plenty of athletes that they used what they used in terms of their training philosophies and discipline, that after their sport, they apply that to the rest of their life. And here's a simple fact: the principles that allow you to exceed in anything succeed will likely allow you to succeed in all aspects of your life. And those always make the great stories. Next slide.
I'm glad you presented that, Bob, because we've talked about that over the years, right? That was actually published in Sports Illustrated when people actually read magazines. And in fact, there was a further follow-up one and said, if you're able to win the gold medal but die the next day, 10% of people still said they would do it.
Wow.
That's the drive in these people.
Yeah.
So when you see Eddie Hall there doing it, you may want to excel, but when everything's going on with that performance at that level,
Yes.
It's a different story. So thanks for sharing that. And I know a lot of these guys right here.
Well, yeah, at that conference, one of the things that we were talking about is the price that these athletes pay. And these big dead bodybuilders, that was from T Nation. That one guy in the center, I put his picture up there, 22 years old, never saw his 23rd birthday. You don't want to be playing with these things. You're playing with fire. And since we were talking about testosterone, people said, what's the problem with testosterone? Well, it's highly addictive. And so if you start supplementing that, you feel like Superman. And then, okay, what happens when they take that away? Well, you have a crash and you want to get it back. And I think that's the sad reality of what happens to so many of these athletes. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and the guy in the lower right, Tom Prince, he was actually an NPC national champion. I had the honor of giving him out the award for the overall victory in 1997. And he's still alive, but he had severe kidney damage, kidney transplant. And he's about 150 pounds at this point, but lucky to be alive. Mike Matarazzo on top, great bodybuilder from Massachusetts, Mr. USA, actually, and he did pass away, very sadly.
They lost a lot of them. So Robert Sapolsky, if people really want to investigate a real brainiac, he's written so many great books and is given some of the best lectures ever. But this was a series of essays called "The Trouble with Testosterone," and he said, you know what? We look at us guys, and we represent less than half the population, but we represent in the upper 90th percentile of violent crimes. And he said, how is this? Well, part of it, we are wired to be warriors. We are wired to be protectors. And ultimately, what we need to do is really get that frontal cortex, getting our ability to control our thoughts and emotions and actions. And you know what? It takes discipline. And so ultimately, when we start looking at, principles for wellness, I like to call it the Goldilocks rule. Very, very simply, too much is not right. Too little is not right. You want to have just the right amount. And when people start supplementing with testosterone, they'll actually downregulate the receptors for testosterone. So they need more and more to get it done. But the negative effects, the cardiovascular effects, the brain effects, these are things that continue to happen at these higher doses that can be extremely problematic. And so here's a fascinating thing. Too much or too little testosterone is associated with all-cause mortality and especially cardiovascular risk. Next slide. And so nice graphic about what happens when testosterone is low. And none of us want any of these things, but the solution is not to bring in testosterone from a foreign source. Next slide. So Androgens in and of themselves are associated with different things related to cardiovascular challenge, including blood pressure. So, I taught a series on menopause with Joe Collins in the early 2000s, and he would talk about estrogens. He'd say estrogens, whether you make them, whether you take them, you need to get rid of them every day. Well, that would be true of testosterone too, but it's actually estrogen that is the thief of testosterone in so many men. Next slide. And this was a study where they actually gave men that tested low with testosterone. And so they supplemented them with testosterone, and yet the rate of cardiovascular events, even in these guys that were low, with physiologic doses went up. So there's more to the story than just testosterone. If we're going to get it, we need to improve all aspects of physiology, especially reducing body fat, helping liver function, etc. I first heard this quote in the 1990s from a researcher named Harry Eidner, and he said, we're swimming in a sea of estrogens in plastics, estrogens in pesticides, estrogens injected into animals. And so you can't watch a sporting event without seeing an advertisement for sexual dysfunction, for low testosterone. Why is it? A lot of it is related to these estrogens. Next slide. And so then you start looking at the things that happen in terms of plaquing with supplemental testosterone, and it's problematic, and it's definitely documented that if you're low in supplement, you're going to increase your cardiovascular risk. Next slide. There was a documentary called The Disappearing Male. Next slide. And what they had talked about was there's been a global decline in men being born, as well as a global decline in sperm count. And they can track this back 70 plus years at this point, which, by the way, parallels all the toxins in our environment. Next slide. This was a study of something of an Indian tribe in Canada called the Amjanong. And it's fascinating that nature will generally increase the level of males born, because if someone's going to do something stupid and die early, it's going to be a young man, whether it's going off to war or picking a fight or doing this crazy thrill seeking that puts their life at risk. But this Amjanong tribe, when they built petrochemical factories around their tribe, suddenly the amount of males born went from about 60% down to about 30% in a decade. And what they came to realize is these estrogens that they were exposed to caused first-term spontaneous abortions. These babies were dying in utero. Next slide. And then you start looking at sperm count. The last 50 years, down nearly 60%. Next slide. And so infertility is a real issue. So now to the topic of cardiovascular, still the top killer, 1 in 3 deaths. Next slide. And I found this to be a very nice article that was peer-reviewed, and people tend to like peer-reviewed about ways where we can actually improve cardiovascular health. So diet is number one. I'm glad they listed that. Malnutrition, number one cause of death on the planet, has been for a long, long time. Weight management. In this country, we have 2/3 of people overweight, more than 1/3 obese. Exercise. We've got the vast majority of the population doesn't even get a baseline level of exercise every single day. Smoking, fortunately, has been on the decline, but there's still people that do it. And don't think that vaping is a better option. We're finding that there's a lot of challenges with that as well. Blood pressure, cholesterol, and glucose are going to wrap out what this article said. And so I'm going to expand that as this presentation goes on. Next slide. So, Jamie, you'll appreciate this. I and Joe as well. I was at a conference in Orlando, Florida, and Barry Sears was the keynote speaker. And he just came out with this book called The Zone. And he put up a copy of the USDA food pyramid, and such a powerful statement. He said, if ever there's a terrorist-like plot designed to destroy the health of the world, this would be it. The 9 to 11 servings of genetically modified gluten grains at the base and going up from there, it's literally killing people. Next slide.
Yeah, our team, Dr. Bob, actually, just like you did, created the Great Pyramid of Health.
Yeah.
Which looked at the foundations being things like your Magnificent Seven, right? The foundations of good lifestyle, and then probiotics, enzymes, and prebiotics, macro and micronutrients, phytonutrients, essential fats. It actually looks a lot like this, so it's really interesting.
Yeah. Look at that at the top.
Great mind thinks alike, right? So, food is going to be the base of my nutrition pyramid, followed by superfoods, followed by functional foods. Then, most of the time, a good enough level of multivitamin, multimineral are built into the functional foods. The
Exactly.
resolvent form of omega-3, I actually lectured at a major compounding pharmacy conference on the topic of resolvins. And hopefully you guys are getting a lot of calls on that because people are saying, why don't we know about this? Over 1,000 published PubMed studies, critical. I call them activated omega-3s because that's really what the body does. It's going to convert it to the resolvent form. You
And
mentioned
those are the
probiotics.
SPMs, right?
Yes.
Yep.
And you've been
absolutely.
using Nutritional Frontiers SPMs. What have your results been?
Epic. I mean, whatever I use from you
Love
guys,
it.
whatever you got what I need and the delivery system that matches, we're going to use it because you guys put out things that work. And, here's what I'm going to tell people watching. Don't take my word on it. We're going to give you protocols. You apply it, see what it does. And if you apply the principles of frequency, duration, intensity, quality, and timing of stimuli, you're going to get people better so much faster. Their heads are going to spin. Next slide. So malnutrition, global nutrition report, next slide, was and still is the number one cause of death. This is many, many decades running. So you might realize that there's a lot of press in 2020 about something else that might be risky to people. But let's face it, if people were healthy, had good nutrition status, and I'll go to my 82-year-old parents. They both got that virus, and I don't even mention it because there's still some censorship going on.
Thank you.
But I sent them a protocol, nutrients. My parents were over this in less than 7 days, at 82. So who couldn't recover from that? Maybe people that were really dealing with serious issues. If we wanted to isolate anybody, protect them, that would be them. But the rest of us, let's go out and get that virus. Let's beat it. Let's create that herd immunity. Next slide. And every country of the world is affected. So we now have global audiences. So all over, people, it's not, the most developed country like us or the least developed country. It's every country in between as well. Next slide. And so it's simple math. Here's what I teach my nutrition students. It takes 30 elements to grow healthy plants, animals, and humans. Next slide. But for over 100 years, they've been putting 3 back in the soil: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So if you put 3 in for every 30 you take out, eventually you're going to have a problem. And that's where we're at. Next slide. Especially since the 1950s.
I was just thinking of this Time magazine cover right before we went on, and I saw your topic heading. I thought, man, I remember, I can see it in my I can see that Time magazine.
Around 2000.
Well,
What year was that, Doc?
2003 is my.
Yeah, I think it's 203. So you look at it, notice it says the link between inflammation, heart attacks, cancer, Alzheimer's, and other things. I'll go to Barry Sears for a moment because he was a big fan of talking about silent inflammation, the level of inflammation that exists before the below the pain threshold. And we've all got that. So the next question is, do we have too much? Hey, simple blood test, right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about Dr. Sears was that, remember when he came out with the whole zone, right? This is right on the tail end of the fat-free craze.
Yes.
Right? So for him to have the courage to come out with that to me was awesome because I was personal training back then, and people would be like, 30% fat? I'm like, yes. Your body's made of fat, your brain, your cells. So I love that he did that. At least it gave us some momentum going in the new direction.
Well, and when you start talking about that training level, these athletes that do keep their fats in check and use the right ratios, they get shredded, ripped faster. It's absolutely powerful. Next slide, please. So, there's a reason they call this the sad diet, the mad diet. The only thing that really has color there are the packages. I tell people every single bite leads to inflammatory process, depression, cortisol increase, acidity within the body. If you ever wanted to create a protocol to kill people, just give them this diet consistently. Next slide. And so, what about anti-inflammatory foods? I'm going to go with Jack LaLanne there. He said, if God made it, it's okay. If man made it or messed with it, stay away. And for far too many people, it's the right side of that graphic that makes up the vast majority of their diet. Next slide. And this is my way of creating a visual that makes sense. I remember reading so many years ago about the 4 forms of nitric oxide, and the inflammatory form that under an acute
That's why I
inflammatory
was so
episode,
interested in nitric oxide.
inflammatory nitric oxide goes up 1000x, not 1000%, but 1000x. And so inflammation devours nitric oxide, and that's a python swallowing a sheep. And that's what's going to happen to our nitric oxide when we let inflammation get out of control within our body. Next slide. And the Nobel Prize winning molecule, nitric oxide, a single dose can dilate blood vessels by 62%. Next slide. So it's fascinating that I was on a private Zoom, semi-private Zoom with Nathan Bryant, who's on the Nobel Prize winning research team, wrote the nitric oxide solution. And he was talking about how what they came to realize is the best solution to the virus was actually increasing nitric oxide status. These individuals that couldn't get oxygen to their tissue, even though their blood was carrying it, nitric oxide was the solution. And very, very simply, they worked very, very hard to publish this, and you'd be shocked how censored that was. Somehow, some way, the powers that be didn't want the world knowing
That's
that
right.
inhaling nitric oxide, which was simple enough to just control the inflammatory process and good supplements, would have been life-saving probably to millions. Next slide.
Yeah, we've had quite a few of our healthcare professionals recommending Power Fuel, right, Joe? What's the combination in there?
I mean, Power Fuel and CircuCore, these are our 1-2 punch for helping the body produce nitric oxide. And that's, I think, one of the biggest misconceptions is you can take it. You can't take it. It's a gas. Your body makes it. But you got to give it the tools to make it. And citrulline and arginine are the 2 major tools to make it. Yeah.
Well, how fun. So this is Nathan Bryant right here. He actually wrote this article, and you start looking at what happens to the arteries as nitric oxide depletes. And very, very simply, you're waiting for a cardiovascular accident. If we can keep those levels good throughout our entire life, and you mentioned modulating the inflammatory process and giving the precursors, that's the way to make it happen. Next slide. And, since I was giving a conversation about all of nutrition, here's what I tell people. Jack LaLanne said, if God made it, it's okay. If man made it, stay away. Michael Pollan said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. I'm going to tweak that. Eat real food, clean food, not too much, not too often, every color, every day, in a way that honors your physiology, your genetics, and your body goals, mostly plants. And we get people to do that, and they have a huge leg up on creating health. Next slide. And so that's what I actually consider a picture of a really, really good diet. Next slide. And the journal Advances in Therapy, this is a very, very powerful study that really the whole world needs to know. And what they did in this study is they took 2 age-matched, health-matched people, and they actually took tissue biopsies and measured nutrient levels. One group was given an all-organic, macronutrient balanced diet. The other group was given that same diet and supplementation. They went back into the tissue 60 days later, and they came to realize that a good diet did not improve the nutrient status at all. And the conclusion from the article was very, very simple. Food is too weak to replete depleted cells and bodies. Therefore, supplementation is advisable for everybody. So I don't care if you're the most elite person on the planet with the cleanest diet, you need supplementation. And if you're anything less than that, you need more supplementation. Next slide.
Way I always say it, Doc, is man does not live by food alone.
Well, how brilliant is that?
You could have that one, Doc.
I like it. I like it.
It's epic.
So, and when I teach obesity, I always tell people, look, we've heard the phrase little old lady, little old man. Why don't we hear big old lady, big old man? Well, here's a fact. Big people don't get to be old, and they live the final miserable decade of their existence with a major medical disability, taking tons of medications. Guess what? We can turn that around at every step of the process. It's never too late. You have a pulse, you have a prayer. Let's get you on the right program. Next slide. And then body weight versus longevity. This is something that's been published for decades. Somewhere in that ideal range of BMI between 22 and 27 is going to get you the longest. But here where we have a little qualifying factor, when Evander Holyfield first came in, I did a body composition test, bioimpedance analysis. The guy had 4% body fat, but yet his BMI technically put him in obese. Well, how can that be? Well, believe it or not, you can get too much muscle. But if I'm going to err on the side of one thing, I will. But you start looking at these power lifters, and I still treat a beautiful young lady named Tanya Clark, whose brother was Anthony Clark.
Oh, yes.
And I a couple of times I had the joy of training with Anthony here in Houston, Texas. That's his home. But Anthony at 5'7", 365 pounds, never saw his 40th birthday, congestive heart failure. So you can have too much muscle. Next slide.
I got chills, Dr. Bob. We work with Anthony Clark in the 90s when he hit 800 pounds on the bench press. His brother, Larry Clark, was a client of ours for years. And, one question I want to ask you, years ago, you would see the athletes, even if they had the lower body fat, when they retired, they would get heavier and they didn't live as long. I'm using an example like Jeff Saturday. He was a Colts center. Now he's their coach, ironically enough, but he leaned down. Merrill Hodge, a lot of these athletes that are living longer. So even if the body fat's low, are you recommending the weight should be reduced as we age?
Yeah, definitely beyond those warrior years, and so,
we're all beyond those.
Yeah, well, at least those of us in this conversation, even though you guys look like you can still handle yourself beyond well, how wonderful is that? But yeah, if you're in a sport that's going to require that extra mass, well, then while you're in that sport, you need the mass. But as soon as you're done, let's start working on longevity at that point.
Yeah, I think people can do it in phases. I've done it in phases over the last 10 years, and now I'm ready to take the next phase. Because I'm looking at the stats. I'm like, okay, let's get this under control, right?
Yep. The combination of body composition and BMI is still the best equation, though, right, Bob?
Oh, absolutely. You want to be in, you can still have a ton of muscle with a BMI of 27, and yet you can carry on that super low body weight. And you start looking at sumo wrestlers, it's so fascinating that they've actually done body composition studies on these guys, and they don't have anywhere near the visceral adipose tissue that you would think. They have a lot of it is subcutaneous, but even with subcutaneous fat, visceral is most dangerous. But even with subcutaneous, they're still dying 2 decades earlier. Next slide. And so, I decided to calculate this because there's so much variability in determining how much extra vasculature is associated with each pound of fat. And, as an engineer, I said, okay, what do we know? And I started looking at the vascular amounts that were there and what was in the blood vessels. And I decided to do my calculation. A kilogram of fat was easy enough to calculate. 41.33 extra miles of blood vessels. Reduce that down to a pound, that's dividing by 2.22, 18.79 miles of muscles in an extra pound of fat. And guess what? We know that lean tissue is far more vascular than fat. Next slide, please. And by the way, I had to really hunt this down because I had heard anywhere from 10 times as much blood vessels. What was peer-reviewed was lean tissue 3 times as vascular as fat. So about 55 extra miles of muscle, or of blood vessel.
Of blood vessels.
Pound of muscle. Yep.
Wow.
That's going to put a strain on the heart. Now, you want to start looking at things real easy. I used to teach with a slide. I'd say big belly, big problem. We certainly want to make sure we don't have that visceral adipose tissue. We want to keep that waist at least half of our height, less than half of our height. Next slide. And that was one of the easy measurements that people could make. But, I've done a lot of different consults with people, and you'd be shocked.
36.
There are people out there that they're somehow their body's wired to put on more visceral adipose tissue than subcutaneous tissue. And they'd say, I gained just 5 or 10 pounds and suddenly my blood pressure went up a ton. Well, we come to realize that when you get that visceral adipose tissue, you actually develop fatty kidney. Plenty of people talked about fatty liver, and we'll show that in the next slide, but and go ahead and show that. When they actually develop this fat in the abdominal cavity, they actually compress the blood supply to the kidneys. the liver and kidneys get the highest blood flow at rest,
All the kidney problems.
the body has to elevate the pressure to start
Mm.
perfusing the kidney and detoxifying the blood. Next slide. And liver, most of us are know about that term, non-alcoholic fatty liver. You get fatty liver, fatty kidney, fatty abdominal cavity. You're at your death waiting to happen. Next slide. And here's one thing that I've taught for decades, and I always found this to be absolutely amazing. This is talking about cardiac output at rest versus fight or flight. But at rest, the tissue that gets the most blood is the liver. The tissue that gets the second most blood is the kidneys, followed by the brain. So you look at that, and the body's highest priority at rest is actually detoxification. So I let people know, if we're not fighting for our life, our body wants to cleanse itself. Why don't we make that our top clinical intervention? And by the way, if you are stuck in fight or flight flow like so many people, then we do a stress reset and a detox. And that's where we really get a lot of bang for our buck. Next slide. Quit smoking. I think most people know about this. Smoking will kill 1 and 2, so don't do that. Next slide. And this is an absolutely amazing review of the total statistics. So, the Surgeon General declared smoking a super risk factor. And just like that, people reduce their amount of smoking, which is a great thing. Next slide. And then we fast forward and we look at the decline in cardiovascular death. And I took the decline in cigarette smoking and the ramp up of cigarette smoking and the decline, and you'll see that those two graphs fit perfectly on one another. So medicine's going to try to tell you it's the statins, it's the antihypertensives, it's all this other stuff. It may just be that people are making a better lifestyle choice. Next slide. And we've heard sitting is the new smoking. I like to tell people that I was giving a lecture in London at a children's cancer charity. And we were raising money for children's cancer. And I thought it was pretty fascinating that there were, a lot of medical doctors in the audience. They didn't know anything about nutrition and cancer, which was fascinating. But one person was talking about exercise. Another person was talking about mindset. I was talking about nutrition. The person that talked about exercise said that most people are fit enough to do the things they enjoy in life. So here's what I'm going to encourage people. Pick something that you enjoy that requires you to move your body, whether it's dancing, whether it's basketball, whether it's just walking your dog. Find a way to enjoy something that allows you to move. Next slide.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob, because I was thinking when you were saying that, how many people's activities are sedentary, right? I'm not a big sit down and watch TV all day guy, right? I watch the game and stuff, but the walking, I think just having active lifestyle is such a key component. And I think that's where people have really lost a lot of momentum in their health, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's also a matter of terminology. When you say exercise, that can turn somebody off. If you say movement, it maybe won't. So just get up and move. That's where we're lacking.
I like what Dr. Bob said, 30 minutes every day in a healthy way. If you're laying in bed at 11:30, you haven't done it, get your butt up and do it. See, I do listen, Bob. That was a long time ago.
You know what that was? And I love that you listen. I'll tell you what, I know that those people that made that commitment and realized in a short period of time, we do a stress reset, we do a detox, we get them moving for 10 days. There's a lot of people that feel better than they have in decades. Now, they might have a little soreness, they might have a little detox reaction. Okay, so what? 10 days. Pay the price for decades of better life. Next slide. And so, when I would lecture with Charles Poliquin, and absolutely love Charles, he was such a brainiac and such a great researcher. And we were on the same page for the extreme athletes. It was not a matter of overtraining. It was essentially under recovery. They didn't nourish their body like they needed to. They didn't get the right amount of sleep like they needed to. And if you can do those things, or go with your pyramid, my pyramid, eat right, drink right, think right, move right, sleep right, poop right, talk right, we humans have phenomenal potential. You look at a guy like David Goggins, who's probably taken the extreme to the extreme. He's proven that people can do far more than they ever thought they could. Next slide. And this one I think is obvious to hopefully most people watching this. As body mass index goes up, I don't care if it's muscle, I don't care if it's fat, you increase those extra miles of vasculature, your heart will have to pay a price. And in time, people will become hypertensive. It's a straight line relationship. More weight gained, more probability of high blood pressure. Next slide. Now, statins. I'm happy to see that there's a lot of data that you can find that's not censored on YouTube talking about statins just really being one of the, could we call it the biggest lie ever told?
Greatest medical myth of our time.
It's right up there. So picture, I don't consider 60 too old, knocking on the door of that. 58 tomorrow, as a matter of fact, celebrating all those beautiful years.
Oh, happy birthday, Dr. Bob. 58.
Well,
58, he's a youngster.
Never looked so good. Look at this guy. Crowd's going crazy.
So picture this, right? If you're over 60, half of men, 38% of women are taking these cholesterol-lowering drugs. Mm-hmm. But let's say what the British Medical Journal had to say about that. Next slide. I guess I'll have that's in a few slides away, but testosterone is shut down at least 3 different mechanisms by statins. So, people started feeling bad. They were overweight. They were over fat. They start giving a statin. They have a worse problem. They start giving them testosterone. Aromatase from body fat turns it into estrogen. It's just a vicious cycle. Next slide. But here was the study from the British Medical Journal. And notice what the title of it is: lack of association or even an inverse association between high levels of LDL and total mortality. And it was for 92% of people. They actually found out 92% of people over the age of 60 live longer with a higher LDL. Next slide. So this whole idea of poisoning the body's production of a necessary molecule is absolutely insane. And then, not having it standard of care. If there were a few people that were going to take this, why not give the CoQ10 with it, et cetera? Next slide. So, we've got our HDL, and the rule is we want our highs high, our lows low. The magic point for HDL is 60. There's only 10% of people that have an HDL above 60 that have cardiovascular disease. But notice that HDL is good at even clearing toxins, buffering stress, decreasing clotting, reduces the inflammatory response, et cetera. So HDL is our friend. And guess what? Exercise, deep sleep, even good quality alcohol, low dose consistently is good to raise HDL. Next slide. When you start looking at triglycerides, the most important number is HDL. The second most important is triglyceride. I listened to a Jeff Bland functional medicine interview, a decade or so ago with a cardiologist, and they said, they did a huge study at Stanford, and they took the worst of the worst cardiovascular cases, and when HDL exceeded triglycerides, just through lifestyle, every one of these people started the process of reversing plaquing of their arteries. So as triglycerides exceed HDL, the probability of a cardiac event goes up exponentially. Next slide. And triglycerides, those are the bad animals, atherogenic. And by the way, the body converts excess glucose to triglycerides. Why? Because triglycerides are less damaging than glucose. So make sure that glucose is in check, the triglycerides are in check, the liver's working, the kidney's working, there's not too much body fat. Next slide. And then insulin. Insulin is something that, we talk about it in terms of insulin resistance, but we need insulin. Insulin is absolutely life critical. And I tell people, this was a weightlifting conference, insulin is both anabolic and anti-catabolic. And there was a University of Texas physician that wrote a book years ago called Nutrient Timing. And he said, you know what? If you do a really hard workout, if you deplete glycogen from your muscle, feel free to have some honey, to have a higher glycemic index carbohydrate. That insulin spike will actually deplete the muscles faster. Next slide. And, when I break down everything that we look at in terms of what we know about being catabolic and anti-anabolic, insulin is our friend if it's in check. Cortisol is the enemy. Quality nutrition, especially branched chain amino acids, are good. And let's not forget about growth hormone. Growth hormone is released with deep sleep and strong physical exercise. and the liver activates growth hormone to IGF-1. And Jamie, I told this story at the conference, but I had an Olympic coach that was really excited about IGF-1 years ago. And he had a baseline of all of his athletes looking at their IGF-1. I was over 50 at the time, so it was within the last 8 years. And what was shocking was I had higher IGF-1 than every Olympic athlete that we checked. But interestingly enough, when we prioritize sleep, when we put them on a good detox, when we put them on a stress reset, then they all had these superhuman levels. So even the best of the best can get better with the right supplemental program. Next slide. Insulin life critical. We're glad to have it. Before they actually found a way to synthesize insulin, if someone had type 1 diabetes, it was a death sentence. So we're very grateful for appropriate use of medication when we have it. But there's a lot of people that rely too much on drugs and not enough on good choices. Next slide. And Flex Wheeler, I don't know if
Oh my gosh, Flex Wheeler, huh?
So I pulled this old reference up because Flex was one of the guys that was playing with insulin, and he pushed himself into kidney failure and kidney transplant. Remember that insulin is going to be bad for the kidneys, bad for the nerves, bad for the blood vessels, bad for the cardiovascular system. Next slide. So we want to keep it in check.
Yeah, and he also now has progressed to the point he did lose his lower leg on one side below the knee. So he works with one of my doctors. It's been terrible because, one of the most gifted bodybuilders ever, and took it too far. It's just really sad.
Too many of them do this. You start looking at the sugar consumption. I'm glad that it leveled off and hopefully even on the decline. We go back to couple hundred years ago, and sugar, the only people would get it would be royalty, and it'd be a total of about 5 pounds a year. We got some people that are doing 5 pounds a week, and we peaked out in the US at 159 pounds per person per year was the average. I mean, that was the late 1990s. Absolutely crazy. Next slide. And by the way,
that's right when they said don't eat fat, right? Sugar consumption went up, right?
Yeah. Oh, and keep in mind the payoff to the Harvard physicians, right? I think a lot of our members know that. I can bring up that slide if needed, but it was a payoff of something like $500,000, and it created so much illness on the planet, absolutely horrible. But sugar is one of the absolute, and there's people still doing it, Jamie. You know it, I know it. How horrible. But sugar, and Jeff Bland said this years ago. I give him a lot of credit. Friends do not let friends become diabetic. And that's been my mantra ever since I started measuring sugar in the 90s. It's like, okay, we don't let you become diabetic. It's just the worst thing we can let happen. Next slide. And it's insulin spikes that increase pulse pressure. So keep in mind, there's something called arterial stiffness. And they had some very, very sophisticated cardiovascular measurements, but then they simply found out that pulse pressure, systolic minus diastolic, was an accurate and very easy to measure representation of arterial stiffness. Next slide. And so as the arteries become stiff, the aging inside the vessels accelerates. And as your vessels get old, you're waiting for a heart attack, stroke, aneurysm to happen. So we don't want that to happen. Next slide. And interestingly enough, measuring pulse pressure, perfectly good indicator of the level of arterial stiffness that people had. So next slide. Simple measurement for doctors is they just take the systolic pressure minus the diastolic pressure. And notice that when they were measured in office, the measurements were higher. And that makes sense. People, I think nearly everybody has a little bit of what we're going to call that white coat syndrome. But then, even people walking around, when that pulse pressure, systolic minus diastolic, got up over 53, they were at high risk. So we want systolic minus diastolic to be less than 45. Next slide. If your arteries are elastic, you have a lot of resilience in them. Consider the word elastic and resilience being the same. Less elasticity, higher plus pressure, challenge with resilience. Next slide. And a simple quote, I don't know who I heard this from first. I should put anonymous down there because I don't recall who said it first, but Those who are the least flexible are most likely to get bent out of shape. And that applies to our arteries as well. This is 100-year-old bodybuilder.
Pretty good.
Mr. Universe, 1952. How absolutely amazing. And guess what? They found out that if you keep training, and obviously not at the level he was training in 1952, you lower cardiovascular risk by keeping those arteries compliant. So as we were saying, when people were doing these heavy lifts with the Valsalva, 450 over 320 was measured. If you keep lifting heavy, you essentially keep those arteries in shape. You keep them compliant. You keep them elastic.
Okay.
It's when you stop that you have a problem. So let's say someone says, they take off for a decade. Then they say, well, let me get back to my old self. You better be gradual about that, because you could be an accident waiting to happen. Next slide. Systolic minus diastolic, 45 tends to be a good number. Next slide, or less than 45. And I actually showed a case, and this is on my YouTube channel. So this is an interesting story. I was giving a health lecture in Colorado, and one of my students was a friend of Ron Worley's, and this guy basically was on a cardiac transplant list. His ejection fraction was 11%. And they said, look, you got to come in and you got to meet my friend, Dr. Bob. So Ron Worley comes up to me before the talk. He says, I have limited time today. Deanna thinks you can help me, but I don't think so. And I said, really, why not? He says, I'm on a cardiac transplant list. I dropped dead years ago. I'm taking 8 different meds. They say I'll likely die before I get my transplant. And I said, well, that's interesting. And I showed him 2 different videos of people that were on cardiac transplant. One woman was actually 70 years old. Her ejection fraction was 18%. In 6 months, this is going to blow you away. We got her up to 65%. We got her to like a healthy 20-year-old. So
over 300% increase in 6 months.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Well,
All right, I want to hear the protocol. Come on.
It's coming. It's coming.
Okay.
So Ron Worley, by the way, was at 11%. In 10 days, we got him to 33%. And now he's at 55%. Mm-hmm. So now look at the bottom of this here. He was having 13,000 premature ventricular contractions every single day. And that was on medication. That was all kinds of problems. He said, I always felt like I was drowning in my chest. We got him down to less than 800 in that 10 days. And that's the magic number. So picture that if your heart is beating 72 beats a minute, 60 minutes an hour, that's over 4,000 beats an hour times 24 hours a day. It's like 100,000 beats. Well, guess what? 800 is less than 1%. And that's what the cardiologists were happy with. Next slide. And go past that because that's a video that probably won't stream well. He was, by the way, an ex-bodybuilder that had this problem. And, when he was telling his story, he says, yeah, I was pretty sure I was going to die before I got my transplant. Next slide. And so then I did a Zoom after I did that, and played his video on my YouTube. People said, well, what did you do? So I actually showed the protocol with what we did. And so big thing was going to be a functional food for inflammatory process, D3K2. We did taurine 5 grams 3 times a day. That stabilizes the cardiac membrane potential. We did a stress reset with melatonin, theanine, Ganoderma spores every waking hour. We did resolvins and regular type omega-3s. We did CoQ10 because that's considered to be one of the top cardiovascular nutrients of all time. And I also added lipoic acid. And what I teach people is lipoic acid is essentially the bridge from anaerobic energy to aerobic energy. It's a bridge beyond the Krebs cycle. And the lab marker that I used was lactic acid dehydrogenase. His levels were super high. He was never getting into aerobic function. And with that terrible energy efficiency, you're not going to succeed in life. And within 10 days, next slide, we turned everything around. So now I'm going to share the references. European Heart Journal. I don't know why they're calling CoQ10 a drug, but here's what they said about CoQ10. The first drug to improve heart failure mortality in over a decade. It's not a drug, right? We make CoQ10, but our ability to make it declines with time. Next slide. Taurine, magnesium, absolutely phenomenal for stabilizing the heart membrane. Next slide. The omega-3s, probably a lot of your group has seen this, and then the resolving form even better. Next slide. And omega-3 anti-arrhythmatic, took them till 2019 to publish that, even though we probably suspected that for many, many, many decades. Next slide. Omega-3s prevent heart attack, stroke, and cancer by 13 different mechanisms. Next slide. And then we start talking about the resolvins being even more powerful at resolving arrhythmia. In fact, I love that term resolvins, the SPM, specialized pro-resolvin mediators, because I haven't found anything that doesn't get better with those on board. Just that simple. Next slide.
Yes.
It's a standard tool in my toolkit. So there it is. By the way, resolvins, bodies make them, but as they become sick, as they become intoxicated, as they become inflamed, as they become stressed, as they become malnourished, or as they become the typical patient walking in your door, they have a hard time converting omega-3s to resolvins. That's why we give the SPMs. And by the way, Dr. Sirhan, 2015 is when he figured that out, and how to make it and give it to people. Nobel Prize nominated research. Next slide. Whenever we can stimulate GABA, this is phenomenal. We can prevent ventricular arrhythmias. And that's going to be the conversion of glutamate to GABA. That requires taurine, that requires magnesium, that requires B6. So we want comprehensive nutrition. Next slide.
Calm down.
Yep. That's what it uses.
Theanine, a natural way to increase GABA. This, by the way, is good for the heart, but it also crosses the blood-brain barrier. So it's great for the mind as well. Next slide. And Ganoderma. People that consume it fall asleep faster, sleep deeper longer, wake up more refreshed. And one of the mechanisms there is a GABAergic mechanism. Next slide. And when I give the stress reset, melatonin, theanine, Ganoderma spores every waking hour, 7 to 10 days. For some people, this in and of itself, absolutely life-changing. Next slide. And I tell people, you start looking at Ganoderma. This was a study on rats. They gave them a clotting agent known as kynic acid. And when they would give rats kynic acid, they figure out a dose that would basically kill or paralyze every single animal. Then they asked the question, all right, what dose of aspirin would actually change that around? Well, 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram. Then they said, well, what about Ganoderma? 60 micrograms per kilogram. Next slide. And Ganoderma, the nice thing about it prevents abnormal clotting without promoting abnormal bleeding. You look at the anti-clotting agents they have pharmaceutically, 1 in 11 people will have a major bleeding episode when they take the pharmaceuticals to prevent clotting. Next slide. And so, Ganoderma coffee, one of my favorites, people could have a choice. If you just weighed 70 kilograms, right? And that's certainly less than the average male wears, but that's the standard they use in medicine. That 70 kilogram male would need 9 baby aspirin a day or 2 cups of Ganoderma infused coffee. Next slide. And that wrapped up what I taught at that Swiss conference. But here's the simple thing. You guys have everything that people need to stay healthy, not just in terms of cardiovascular, in terms of vessel compliance, in terms of inflammatory process, in terms of prevention, in terms of modulating insulin, in terms of getting people better and longer lives. But quite simply, you having it doesn't get the job done. People need to get it into patients' bodies. And that's the beautiful thing about the formulas that you've created and your shakes, best tasting in the entire industry. If it doesn't taste good, people aren't going to look forward to it. But you figured out a way to give people all the nutrients they need in a way that they enjoy getting it. And what a magic combination.
Oh, thanks so much, Dr. Bob. I learned so much today and reinforced some of the things I've been learning from you over the last 20 years. And we know you're so busy, and we really appreciate you being so generous with all your wisdom.
I'll tell you what, I never fail. I mean, there's so many slides in that presentation that I'm going to, memorize and have for my own
and steal.
Steal.
Okay.
I was trying to say it without saying steal them, Bob. But yeah, I did give you the, man doesn't live by food alone. So that's a good treat.
That's a good one. I love it.
Well, thanks for all the support. We appreciate you coming on. God bless you and your family during the holidays, and look forward to seeing you live next year. Going to be joining the team at Nutritional Frontiers at our professional training events.
Perfect.
Have a great day, and God bless.